I am live. I am live. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good people, wherever you're watching from. My name is Martini Moragewa Moreidi, and today, actually, it's this evening. I'm recording this on the evening of Sunday, June 14th, 2020, coming to you to read to you an introduction to this book that I've been reading, The Prince by Niccolo Machiavelli. You've probably heard about it. Some of you have probably read it. Some of you have probably never read it. And some of you probably have never even heard about it. So if this is the first time of hearing about The Prince by Niccolo Machiavelli, or if you've never read it before, I hope by listening to this introduction, you'll get inspired to check it out. And if you want to check it out, I'll be posting a new chapter. The chapters are not long. Uh, if I make the videos, I imagine they'll be less than 10 minutes long, but has about 25 chapters. So over the next course of 25 days, excuse me, 25 days, I will be posting a video because I'll record multiple of them, but schedule them to be released on particular days. Anyway, if you haven't subscribed to my channel, please subscribe to my channel. If you haven't liked any of my videos, like my video, comment, subscribe, do any of those four activities. You can do all four, and it'll make me feel good a little bit, a little bit. There's a little bit of joy that comes when you see, or when I see, I got one more subscriber. Right now, I'm at lucky number 13. Who's gonna go to 14? I don't know. It could be you. So please subscribe, like, comment, share. Anyway, this introduction and this book is translated by Tim Parks. You can see the name over there. I hope you can. Tim Parks is who translated it. Made it his own. Anyway, he'll explain his process in the introduction, and I hope you'll get to check it out. I've never read this book before, but reading this translation of it actually made me a little bit. It's not sad. I kind of like regretful. Yeah, regretful that I hadn't read it in the past, but I guess I was meant to read it now. Anyway, I'm gonna begin. Introduction. Necessity. Must. Have to. Inevitably. Bound to. These are the words that recur incessantly throughout The Prince. And then again, success, victory, prestige, achievement, and on the other hand, loss, failure, defeat, death. These opposites are linked together by an almost obsessive use of because, so that, hence, therefore, as a result, as a consequence. From start to finish, we have a vision of a man maneuvering precariously in a suffocating net of cause and effect. What is at stake is survival. Anything extra is luxury. The Prince was written by a 44-year-old diplomat facing ruin. After 14 years of influence and prestige, a change of regime had led to his dismissal. Suspected of conspiring against the new government, he was imprisoned and tortured. The rapid reversal of fortunes could not have been more devastating. Found innocent and released, he left town to live with his wife and family on a small farm. For a worldly man and compulsive womanizer, used to being at the frenetic heart of public life, these too felt like punishment. Idle and bitter, he tramped the hills by day and in the long empty evenings began to write down some considerations on how to win power and above all, how to hold on to it, how not to be a victim of circumstance. The result was a slim volume that would be a scandal for centuries. Niccolo Machiavelli was born in Florence, Italy in 1469, the same year Lorenzo de' Medici, Il Magnifico, came to power. First male child after two daughters, Niccolo would grow up very close to his father, Bernardo, an ex-lawyer, mostly unemployed, with good contacts but no significant wealth or influence. If the son was to rise in the world, and he was determined to do so, he would have to count on his own wits and charm. Niccolo's younger brother, Toto, chose not to compete and went into priesthood. The boy's mother, it should be said, was an extremely devout woman, a writer of religious poems and hymns. Their father, on the other hand, was skeptical, more at home with the sober works of Latin antiquity than the Bible. Niccolo may have taken his writing skills from his mother, but over divisions on religion, he stood with his father and the Roman historians. One says of Lorenzo il Magnifico that he came to power. But officially, Florence was a republic, and since Lorenzo was only 20 years old in 1469, he was far too young to hold elected office. An explanation is required. When, in the 13th century, the Florentines had thrown out the noble families who used to run the town, they introduced a republican constitution of exemplary idealism. A government of 8 priori, led by one Gonfalonieri, or prime minister, would be elected every 2 months by drawing tags from a series of bags containing the names of well-to-do men from different guilds and different areas of town. This lottery would allow each major profession and each geographical area to be adequately and constantly represented. Every individual of a certain social standing could expect a brief share of power in order that no one could ever seize it permanently. The system was unworkable. Every 2 months, a new government might take a different position on key issues. The potential of instability more or less obliged whichever family was in the ascendant to step in and impose continuity. From 1434 on, the Medicis, first Cosimo, then Piero, then Lorenzo, had been manipulating the electoral process to make sure that most of the names in the bags are friendly to themselves, and that all of those actually selected for government would toe the Medici line. Hence, although the Florentines still liked to boast that they were free citizens who bowed the knee to no man, by the mid-15th century, they were in fact living in something very close to a dictatorship. When the rival Pazzi family tried to assassinate Lorenzo in the Duomo in April 1478, it was because they saw no legitimate way of putting him in his place as an ordinary citizen. Machiavelli thus grew up in a society where distance between how things were actually run and how they were described as being run could not have been greater. He was close to his 9th birthday when the captured Pazzi conspirators, one an archbishop, were hung upside down from the windows of the city's main government building and left there for weeks to rot. He would have understood very young the price of getting it wrong, in politics. The young Machiavelli might also have had reason to doubt that there was any meaningful difference between matters of religion and matters of state. The Pope had backed the Pazzi conspiracy. Priests had been involved in the assassination attempt, and Lorenzo was excommunicated after it failed. The religious edict was a political tool. A war between Florence and Rome ensued, and the hostility only ended in 1480, when Turkish raids on the southern Italian coast prompted a rare moment of unity in the peninsula. Years later, Lorenzo would so ingratiate himself with a new pope as to get his son Giovanni made a cardinal at the age of 13. From excommunication to pope's favorite was quite a change of fortune, and once again it was more a matter of politics than of faith. Nothing, it appeared, was beyond the reach of wealth and astute negotiation. At this point, Machiavelli was 21. We know very little of his early adult life, but one thing he definitely did at least once was to listen to the fiery preacher Girolamo Savonarola, head of the influential monastery of San Marco. Savonarola's was a different kind of Christianity. Rather than the corrupt, pleasure-conscious world of the papacy, whose decadence had offered no resistance to the rise of humanism, this austere monk represented an early manifestation of what we have come to call fundamentalism. A return to the biblical text as the sole authority on earth, and a vision of the church as embattled and defensive in a world increasingly interested in values that had little to do with the gospel story. With great conviction, Savonarola preached the virtues of poverty, advocating the burning of any book or work of art that was impure, and prophesied doom for the sinful Florentines in the form of a foreign invasion. In 1494, his prophecy came true. To get any grasp of Machiavelli's diplomatic career and the range of reference he draws on in The Prince, one must have some sense of the complicated political geography of Italy in the 15th and early 16th centuries, and of the profound change that occurred in the 1490s, a change that would determine Italy's fate for the next 350 years. For most of the 15th century, there had been 5 major players in the peninsula: the Kingdom of Naples, the Papal States, Florence, Venice, and Milan. Extending from just south of Rome to the southern tip of Calabria, the Kingdom of Naples was by far the largest, wedged in the center, with only precarious access to the sea. Florence was the smallest and weakest. All 5 powers were in fierce competition for whatever territory they could take. Having lost much of their overseas empire to the Turks, the Venetians were eager to expand inside the northern Italian plain, Ferrara, Verona, Brescia, and down to the Adriatic coast, Forli, Rimini. Conscious of the size and power of a now unified France to the north, Milan hoped for gains to the south and west, Genoa, as a counterweight. Florence simply tried to get bigger in any way that was convenient. Over the previous century, the Florentines had captured Arezzo, Pisa, and Cortona, and wasted huge energies in a series of failed attempts to conquer Lucca. Rome's aim, under any pope, was always to expand north and east into Romagna and Emilia, with a view to swallowing Perugia, Bologna, Rimini, and Forli, a project that would bring it into conflict with both Venice and Florence. In far south, Naples was governed by a branch of the House of Aragon, but the crown was contested by the Angevin kings of France and by the Spanish royal family, also Aragons, which already ruled Sicily. So the scenario was complicated. Scattered between the large states were at least a score of smaller ones, some no bigger than a town and the surrounding fields, and all constantly under threat of invasion from one enemy or another. However, if the situation was rarely static, it is also true that there were few major changes. As soon as one power achieved some significant military victory, the others immediately formed an alliance against it to halt its progress. Florence, in particular, owed its continuing independence largely to the fact that if Venice, Milan, or Rome tried to take it, the other two at once would intervene to prevent this happening. So for more than 100 years, a certain balance of power had been kept. All this ended with the French invasion of 1494. This invasion was, as Machiavelli himself explains in The Prince, largely the Italians' own fault. For some time, the five states had been in the habit of frightening each other with the threat of foreign intervention. During the war against Rome and Naples in 1480, Florence had invited the French king to pursue his claim to the throne of Naples more actively. In 1482, during a Venetian assault on Ferrara, Florence and Milan had encouraged the Turks to step up their attacks on Venice's maritime possessions. Venice had replied by inviting the Duke of Orleans to pursue his claim to Milan. In a war against Naples in 1483, Pope Innocent VIII had reminded the Duke of Lorraine that he too had a claim to the southern kingdom and invited him to send troops. There was an element of bluff and brinkmanship in these threats. But in 1494, when King Charles VIII of France accepted Milan's invitation to make good his claim to the south of Naples, the bluff was called. Charles marched south with an army far larger than any Italians had ever seen in living memory. From that moment on, the peninsula would not be free from foreign intervention until the completion of the Risorgimento in 1870. Struggling to hold Naples, the French would invite the Spanish from Sicily to split the kingdom with them. And the Spanish, after Charles I of Spain inherited the crown of the Holy Roman Empire, would eventually push France back to the north of Alps, back north of the Alps, put Rome to the sack, and dominate Italy for 150 years. But that is to leap ahead. In 1494, when the French first marched through Lombardy heading for Naples, Florence was directly in their path, and what's more, an ally of Naples. At this point, Lorenzo il Magnifico had been dead for 2 years, and the Medici regime was led by his incompetent son, Piero. So abject was Piero's capitulation to Charles, so spineless his decision simply to surrender the city's dependent territories, that the Florentines rebelled against him. The Medici regime collapsed, and very soon the preacher who had been prophesying this disaster was made Gonfalonieri, first minister, this time on a yearly rather than a 2-monthly basis. Girolamo Savonarola ruled Florence from 1494 to 1498, during which time the city passed from being one of the centers of Renaissance humanism to a book-burning fundamentalist theocracy. Realizing that Savonarola's claim to be God's prophet was far greater threat to his authority than any humanism, skepticism, or eclecticism, The church in Rome did everything possible to bring about his downfall, and in 1498, having lost much of his support in Florence, the preacher was convicted of heresy and burned at the stake. It was shortly after these dramatic events that Niccolo Machiavelli succeeded in getting himself elected to the important position of Secretary of the Second Chancery, one of the two key state departments in Florence, and soon afterwards, Secretary of the Ten of War, a committee that dealt with foreign relations and war preparations. Machiavelli was 28. We have no idea how he arrived at such appointments at this early age. There is no record of any special experience that would warrant such confidence in his abilities. But within months, he was traveling to neighboring states to represent Florence's interests, and over the next 14 years, he would be involved in important, often long drawn out missions to the King of France, the Pope, the Holy Roman Emperor, Cesare Borgia, Caterina Sforza, and many others. In between missions, he was frequently and very actively engaged in Florence's ongoing military campaign to retake Pisa, which had regained its independence during the French invasion. Pisa was crucial to Florentine commerce in that it gave the town an outlet to the sea. Introductions to the prince generally played down Machiavelli's abilities as a diplomat, presenting these years as useful only insofar as they offered him the material he would draw on for his writing after he had lost his position. Machiavelli would not have seen things that way. For more than a decade, he was Florence's top diplomat and proud to be so. And if the missions he undertook did not produce spectacular results, this was largely because he was representing the weakest of the main states in Italy in a period of particular confusion and vulnerability that would eventually see four foreign powers militarily involved in the peninsula: France, Spain, the Holy Roman Empire, and Switzerland. Savonarola had taken Florence towards an alliance with France. The priest's successors followed the same policy, but without any clear vision of how the city might achieve stability and security in the long term. To make matters worse, having decided in 1502 that their gonfaloniere, or first minister, should be elected for life, the Florentines gave the job to Piero Soderini, an honorable man but chronically incapable of making any kind of bold decisions. Machiavelli's diplomatic career was thus mostly taken up in attempts to persuade surrounding and threatening states to leave Florence alone and not to expect financial or military help from her for their wars elsewhere. That is, as far as there was a discernible long-term policy, it was one of prevarication. Far from home, Machiavelli would frequently receive contradictory orders after he had already started negotiating. Arriving in foreign towns, he would find that his expense allowance wasn't sufficient to pay couriers to take his messages back to Florence. Sometimes he could barely afford to feed and clothe himself. Such was the contempt of the more powerful monarchs that he was often obliged to wait days or even weeks before being granted an audience. It is in the light of this frustration that we have to understand Machiavelli's growing obsession, very much in evidence in The Prince, with the formation of a citizen army. Florence was weak partly because of its size, but mostly because it had no military forces of its own. It relied on mercenary armies which were notorious for evaporating when things got tough. Before the gates of Pisa, for example. A power base built on an efficient and patriotic civilian army would give a diplomat like Machiavelli a little more clout and respect when he negotiated, or so he hoped. In, in June of 1502, 4 years into the job, Machiavelli met Cesare Borgia, son of Pope Alexander VI. With his father's support, Borgia was carrying out a new state was carving out a new state for himself on the northern borders of the Papal States, and had just captured the city of Urbino to the east of Florence. Sent on a mission to dissuade Borgia from advancing into Florentine territory, Machiavelli was deeply impressed by the man. Seductive, determined, cunning, and ruthless, Borgia was a leader in the epic mode. Certainly, he could hardly have been more different from the diplomat's dithering boss, Soderini. Machiavelli was on another mission to Borgia in January 1503, when the adventurer invited a group of rebels to negotiations in the coastal town of Senigallia, then had them seized and murdered as soon as they were inside the town walls. Here was a man, Machiavelli realized, determined to take circumstance by the scruff of the neck. It was not so much Borgia's willingness to ignore Christian principles that fascinated him, as his ability to assess a situation rapidly, make his calculations, then act decisively in whatever way would bring the desired result. This modern positivist attitude, where thought and analysis serve insofar as they produce decisive action, rather than abstract concepts, lies at the heart of the prince. Meanwhile, Florence continued to drift. Machiavelli was once again on the scene in 1503, this time in Rome, when Borgia's empire collapsed after both he and his father fell seriously ill. Legend has it that Alexander had accidentally poisoned them both. The Pope died and the son lost his power base. 3 years later, Machiavelli was traveling with the later Pope Julius at the head of the papal army when Julius demanded admission to the town of Perugia. Walked in with only a small bodyguard and told the local tyrant, Giampaolo Baglioni, to get out or face certain defeat. Sure that Baglioni would simply kill Julius, Machiavelli was amazed when the man caved in and fled. Such were the Pope's coercive powers as he then marched north to lay siege to Bologna, then Florence, to Bologna, that Florence was once again forced to enter an alliance and a war in which it had no desire to be involved. As Secretary of the Ten War, Machiavelli enjoyed just one moment of personal glory. In 1509, when the citizen army that he had finally been allowed to form overcame peasant resistance and took the town after a long siege. Given the many failed attempts to capture Pisa using mercenary armies, this victory was a powerful vindication of Machiavelli's conviction that citizen armies were superior. It was also the only occasion in his 14 years of service when Soderini took the initiative with success. But in every other respect, things went from bad to worse. Florence was living on borrowed time. Its freedom depended on the whims of others. 3 years after the capture of Pisa, when Pope Julius, now in alliance with the Spanish, defeated the French at Ravenna, he immediately sent an army to Florence to impose a return of the Medici and transform the city into a puppet state dependent on Rome. After brave resistance, the Florentine army was crushed at Prato, a few miles to the north of the city. Soderini escaped and the Medici returned. Machiavelli was unemployed and unemployable. The scandalous nature of the prince was largely determined by its structure rather than any conscious desire to shock. Originally entitled On Principalities, the book opens with an attempt to categorize different kinds of states and governments at different moments of the development, then moving back and forth between ancient and modern history to establish some universal principles relative to the business of taking and holding power in each kind of state. Given Machiavelli's experience, wide reading, and determined intellectual honesty, the project obliged him to explain that there were many occasions when winning and holding political power was possible only if a leader was ready to act outside the moral codes that applied to ordinary individuals. Public opinion was such, he explained, that once victory was achieved, nobody was going to put the winner on trial. Political leaders were above the law. Had Machiavelli insisted on deploring this unhappy state of affairs, had he dwelt on other criteria for judging a leader, aside from his mere ability to stay in power and build a strong state, had he told us with appropriate piety that power was hardly worth having if you had to sell your soul to get it, he could have headed off a great deal of criticism while still delivering the same information. But aside from one or two token regrets that the world is not a nicer place, Machiavelli does not do this. It wasn't his project. Rather, he takes it for granted that we already know what life, particularly political life, is routinely and sometimes unspeakably cruel, and that once established in a position of power, a ruler may have no choice but to kill or be killed. This is where the words of necessity, must, and have to become so ominous. For the prince is most convincing and most scandalous, not in its famous general statements that the end justifies the means, that men must be pampered or crushed, that the only sure way of keeping a conquered territory is to devastate it utterly, and so on. But in the many historical examples of barbarous behavior that Machiavelli puts before us, without any hand-wringing, as things that were bound to happen. The Venetians find that their mercenary leader, Carmagnola, is not putting much of an effort into his fighting anymore. But they were afraid that if they dismiss him, he will walk off with the territory he previously captured for them. At which point the only safe thing to do was to kill him. Hiero of Syracuse, when given command of his country's army, finds that they are all mercenaries, and realizing that they could neither make use of them nor let them go, he had them all cut to pieces. The climax of this approach comes with Machiavelli's presentation of the ruthless Cesare Borgia as a model for any man determined to win a state for himself, as if such a project were not essentially dissimilar from building a house or starting a business. Having tamed and unified the Romagna with the help of his cruel minister Ramiro de Occo, Machiavelli tells us Borgia decided to deflect people's hatred away from himself by putting the blame for all atrocities on his minister and then doing away with him. So he had de Occo beheaded and his corpse put on display one morning on the piazza in Cesena with a wooden block and a bloody knife beside. The ferocity of the spectacle left people both gratified and shocked. It's not hard to feel. It's hard not to feel as we read the chapters on Borgia that this is the point where Machiavelli's book ceases to be learned but fairly tame. On principalities and is transformed into the extraordinary and disturbing work that would eventually be called The Prince. In short, Machiavelli's attention has shifted from a methodical analysis of different political systems to a gripping and personally engaged account of the psychology of the leader who placed himself beyond the constrictions of Christian ethics and lives in a delirium of pure power. For a diplomat like Machiavelli, who had spent his life among the powerful but never really held the knife by the handle, a state employee so scrupulously honest that when investigated for embezzlement, he ended up being reimbursed monies that were due to him. It was all too easy to fall into a state of envy and almost longing when contemplating the awesome Borgia, who had no qualms about taking anything that came his way and never dreamed of being honest to anyone. At a deep level, then, the scandal of the prince is intimately tied up with the scandal of all writers of fiction and history, who in the quiet of their studies take vicarious enjoyment in the ruthlessness of the characters they describe, but with this difference. Machiavelli systematizes such behavior and appears to recommend it, if only to those few who are committed to winning and holding political power. The author's description in a letter to a friend of his state of mind when writing the book makes it clear what a relief it was during these months immediately following his dismissal, imprisonment, and torture to imagine himself back in the world of politics, if only on paper, on par with history's great heroes. This is an excerpt from the letter. Come evening, I walk home and go into my study. In the passage, I take off my ordinary clothes, caked with mud and slime, and put on my formal palace gowns. Then, when I'm properly dressed, I take my place in the courts of the past, where the ancients welcome me kindly, and I eat my fill of the only food that is really mine, and that I was born for. I'm quite at ease talking to them and asking them why they did the things they did, and they are generous with their answers. So for 4 hours at a time, I feel no pain. I forget all my worries. I'm not afraid of poverty, and death doesn't frighten me. I put myself entirely in their minds. Insofar as The Prince remains a persuasive account of how political power is won and lost, it is so because it eventually focuses on the mind, or, to be more precise, on the interaction of individual and collective psychologies, the latter fairly predictable, the former infinitely varied, the two together dangerously volatile. The book is not a careful elaboration of a rigid, predetermined vision. More and more, as Machiavelli rapidly assesses different kinds of states and forms of government, different contexts, different men, and their successes and failures, he runs up against two factors that defy codification: the role of luck and the mystery of personality. By the end of the book, he is beyond the stage of offering heroes and success stories as models, aware that that if there is one circumstance that a man cannot easily change, it is his own character, even if he wanted to. So Soderini could not have modeled himself on Borgia, nor vice versa. In particular, Machiavelli is fascinated by the way certain personality traits can mesh positively or negatively with certain sets of historical circumstances. Gonna get some water, good people. Hope you're enjoying it. Comment if you're liking this. It's pretty long. Oh my god, I've been waiting for 40 minutes. I still got some ways to go. I have to do this in two parts, good people. I'm gonna have to do this in two parts. So I think I'll call this one part one. Let me see where I can finish it. I didn't realize the introduction was this long. I had read it before. Didn't realize it was this long though. Anyway. A man can be successful in one situation, then fail miserably in another. A policy that works well in one moment is a disaster the next. Rather than one ideal ruler, then, different men are required for different situations. The only key to permanent political success would be always to adapt one's deepest instincts to new events. But as Machiavelli ruefully observes, that would effectively mean the end of luck and the end of history. Machiavelli's own mind was deeply divided during writing of The Prince, and it is the resulting tension that accounts for much of the book's fascination and ambiguity. On the one hand, as a form of private therapy, he was disinterestedly pursuing the truth about power and politics to establish how states really were won and lost would give him an illusion of control and bolster his self-esteem. At the same time, and perhaps less consciously, he was vicariously enjoying, in the stories of Borgia and others, the sort of dramatic political achievements that had always been denied to him. In regard, it's interesting to see how rapidly he glosses over Borgia's abject fall from power, his arrest, imprisonment, and death, almost as if the author were in denial about his hero's ultimate fallibility. Therapeutic as this might have been, however, at another level, The Prince was clearly written for publication and meant as a public performance. Machiavelli loves to show off his intelligence, his range of reference, his clever reasoning. Even here, though his intentions were divided and perhaps contradictory. At his most passionate and focused, he was involved in a debate with all the great historians and philosophers of the past and determined to show his contemporaries that his own mind was as sharp as the best. But in a more practical mood, Machiavelli was planning to use the book as a passport to get himself back into a job. So evident and compelling, he hoped, would his analytical skills appear, that the ruler to whom he formally gave and dedicated the book would necessarily want to employ him. Hence the flattering tone of the opening dedication and the addition of the prince's final patriotic pages proposing that the ruler in question should be the man to rid Italy of foreign oppression. Who was the ruler? Shortly before Machiavelli had been released from prison, Pope Julius had died and been replaced by Giovanni de' Medici, Il Magnifico's son, the man who had become a cardinal at 13. This was March 1513. When he started work on The Prince some months later, Machiavelli had intended to dedicate the book to Giovanni's brother Giuliano, who had been put in charge of Florence after the Medici's return. However, when the effeminate Giuliano began to move away from politics and was replaced in Florence by his aggressive, warlike nephew Lorenzo, Machiavelli decided to switch the dedication to the younger man. Thus far, the writer showed himself flexible in the face of changing events. Yet there is something ingenious and almost endearing in the clever diplomat's miscalculation here. The brilliant reasoning required to convince yourself that you had got a grasp on politics and history. The profound analysis that would demonstrate to your fellow intellectuals that you are as clear-headed as Livy, Tacitus, and Thucydides. Thucydides put together were not the qualities that a young and hardly well-read Medici prince was likely to comprehend, never mind enjoy. Given the book in 1515, Lorenzo probably never opened it, and certainly didn't take time to study Machiavelli's carefully crafted reflections. Then, even if he had read it, would Lorenzo, or indeed any other ruler, have wanted to employ a diplomat who had gone on record as saying that trickery was largely the name of the game, and that though it wasn't important to have religious faith, it was absolutely essential to appear to have one? Machiavelli should have been the first to understand that as an instrument for furthering his diplomatic career, rather than literary and philosophical achievements in his own right, the book's honesty would be self-defeating. The two goals were never compatible. Surprised and disappointed by the prince's failure, Machiavelli went back to womanizing. Aside from routine whoring, he fell in and out of love easily, pursuing passion without discretion or restraint. And just as he had more luck with romance than diplomacy, he had more success when he wrote ironic, sex-centered comedies rather than candid but dangerous political analysis. In 1518, the first performance of his play, The Mandragola, in which a young man invents the most absurd subterfuges to get a married woman into bed, won Machiavelli immediate celebrity. Some years later, Cilicia, which this time had an older man hell-bent on having his way with a very young woman, confirmed his talent. But literary success was not enough for Machiavelli. It was active politics that interested him. And though he labored for 10 years or so on his discourses on Livy, then on a long history of Florence, and finally on a short work entitled The Art of War, it was his old job as the city's principal ambassador that he always yearned for. Finally, in 1525, Pope Clement VII, alias Giulio de' Medici, Giovanni's cousin, drew the ex-diplomat back into politics, asking him for advice on how to deal with the growing antagonism between the French and the Spanish. As an eventual clash between the two great powers inside Italy loomed ever closer, Machiavelli was given the task of overseeing Florence's defensive walls. When the crunch came, however, and the armies of Spain and the Holy Roman Empire, now united under the same crown, marched south into Italy, they simply bypassed Florence, went straight to Rome, and sacked it. It was an occasion of the most disgraceful savagery on a scale Italy had not witnessed for centuries. In the aftermath, the Medici regime in Florence collapsed, and once again Machiavelli was out of favor. Overwhelmed with disappointment and in the habit of taking medicines that weren't good for him, he died in June 1527, aged 58. Having accepted, no doubt after careful calculation, extreme unction. That there are many different roads to notoriety, and that a man's achievements may combine with historical events in unexpected ways are truths Machiavelli was well aware of. So he would have appreciated the irony that it was largely due to Luther's Protestant reform and the ensuing wars of religion that his name became the object of the most implacable vilification, and as a consequence, universally famous. The turning point came in 1572. The Prince had not been published in Machiavelli's lifetime. After circulating for years in manuscript form, then in a printed Latin edition, still entitled On Principalities, it finally appeared in Italian in 1532, only to be put on Pope Paul IV's Index of Prohibited Books in 1559. This partly in response to the prompting of the English Cardinal Reginald Pole, who maintained that, written as it was by Satan's finger, the Prince was largely responsible for Henry VIII's decision to take the English Church away from Rome. Meantime, in France, the conflict between Protestant Huguenots and the Catholics was intensifying and would reach a head under the reign of the sickly young Charles IX, who for the most part was controlled by his mother, the Italian, indeed Florentine, Catherine de' Medici, daughter of the same Lorenzo de' Medici to whom Machiavelli had dedicated the Prince. Catherine had brought a great many Italian favorites into the French court, a move guaranteed to arouse anti-Italian feelings. In general, she sought to dampen down religious conflict which threatened to tear France apart. But nevertheless, she would be held responsible for the St. Bartholomew Day massacre of 1572, when thousands of Huguenots were murdered. One potential victim, Innocent Gentilet, escaped to Protestant Geneva and wrote a discourse contre Machiavel that was to set the tone for anti-Machiavellian criticism for decades to come. Intended as an attack on Catherine de' Medici and militant French Catholicism, and hence a defense of the Huguenots, the book described Catherine as a compulsive reader of Machiavelli and playing on anti-Italian feeling, claimed both queen and writer were representative of a callous and villainous trait in Italian national character. Listed out of context, the ideas developed in The Prince was schematized and simplified, allowing readers to imagine that they had read Machiavelli himself, when what they were actually getting was a travesty that legitimized any form of brutality and rejoiced in amoral calculation. From this point on, Machiavelli's name escaped from the restricted circle of intellectual reflection and became a popular term of denigration. Mac-evil and Machiavellian were typical English corruptions. Mitchell Wiley, a Scottish corruption. Many critics would not bother reading his work in the original, but take their information from Gentilet, whose Anti-Machiavel, as his book became known, was quickly translated into Latin for English readers and then, some 20 years later, directly into English. At this point, the end of the 16th century, the first English translation of Machiavelli's work was yet to appear. Ironically, in the years after the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, as Catherine de' Medici struggled to find some solution to France's civil wars, and in particular to convince Catholics of the need to tolerate existence of the Huguenots, if only in Huguenot enclaves, both she and her supposed mentor Machiavelli once again came under attack, this time from the Catholic side. The accusation was now that, in the attempt to avoid conflict, The religious truths of supreme importance were being subordinated to question of political convenience, something that would eventually transform France, the Catholics feared, into a secular state. Here, the criticism comes closer to the real spirit of Machiavelli. Renaissance humanism, in general, had shifted the focus of intellectual reflection from questions of theology and metaphysical truths to matters of immediate and practical human interest. In general, however, lip service had always been paid to the ultimate superiority of religious matters, and writers had avoided suggesting that there might be a profound incompatibility between rival value systems. It was perfectly possible, that is, to be a good Christian and an effective political leader. Machiavelli, on the contrary, made it clear that, as he saw it, Christian principles and effective political leadership were not always compatible. Situations would arise where one was bound to choose between the two. It was not, as his critics claimed, that he rejected all ethical values outright. The strength, unity, and independence of a people and state certainly constituted goals worth fighting for. "I love my country more than my soul," Machiavelli declared in a letter to fellow historian Francisco Guicciardini. But such goals would not always be achieved without abandoning Christian principles. Two value systems were at loggerheads. To make matters worse, Machiavelli did not appear to be concerned about this. He took it as an evident truth. Christian principles were admirable, but not applicable for politicians in certain circumstances. The idea that all human behavior could be assessed in relation to one set of values was naive and utopian. It was insofar as Machiavelli allowed these dangerous implications to surface in his writing that he both unmasked and himself became identified with what we might call the unacceptable face of Renaissance humanism. How much the presentation of the Machiavellian villain in Elizabethan and Jacobean drama, from Cade and Marlowe through Middleton, Shakespeare, and ultimately Ben Jonson, owed to Gentilet's Machiavel, anti-Machiavel, and how much to a direct knowledge of Machiavelli's writing is still a matter of academic dispute. In the 1580s, an Italian version of The Prince was printed in England, avoiding a publication ban by claiming falsely on the front page that it was printed in Italy. Many educated English people at the time had a good knowledge of Italian. Sir Francis Bacon had certainly read The Prince before its first legal publication in English in 1640. Defending the Florentine in the Advancement of Learning, 1605, with the remark, we are much beholden to Machiavel and others that write what men do and not what they ought to do. Good people, I think I'm going to end. I'm almost on the hour mark. I'm going to continue this video tomorrow at some time, and then possibly post, and the day after I'll officially start, or maybe I don't know. But thank you for watching. Please subscribe. I have to go to sleep. I have an early morning, early day tomorrow. Adios. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe too. Hope you liked the introduction. It is long, good people. I didn't realize how long it was, but I think when I was reading the book, I think the introduction took me about an hour 30 minutes to read, and it was so awesome. That's why I decided I have to read it for my introduction before I begin the series to explain a little bit about the time Machiavelli lived, to explain a little bit about the time period, what he went through, what was going on, the regional politics of the time, which was probably he considered it the global politics. You know. Anyway, thank you for watching. Hope you all have a good, blessed day. Stay healthy, stay blessed. Adios.